Last April, I documented this portion of our garden here at Edible Acres 2. This is, just to give some context, this is our 0.1 acre backyard garden. I made a video about this a few years ago, which I'll link to in a little bit, that shows the conversion of this space from a lawn into a really highly productive food space for us. Our whole system from the get-go, and we're pretty committed to it, has been completely dependent on collected rainwater and not using irrigation from our standard well. And so last year I went ahead and dug in this part of the garden. Is an area, we're on a north-facing slope. It gets pretty darn wet after rains, and in fact you can see where a hand-dug pond is in there, and that pond overflows. So this has been an iterative design process where after rains and during wet times we kind of adjust and deepen and refine the design. And this part of the garden in particular was always super wet. And so last year I went ahead with a shovel and then a post hole digger and dug enough of a hole to fit in. I found this 55-gallon metal drum, just about as rusty as this, with a hole that was blown out on the bottom. So old enough that it's basically just rust and iron at this point. And buried that in the ground, and that worked quite well with a solar panel and a little bilge pump to lift water after rains, but the capacity was relatively low. And so what I did, in the spirit of not spending money and buying new things to do it, is I found some old sheets of roof metal and just simply screwed them together into the shape of a well body and dug down much deeper, basically to as the depth that I could handle physically. It's been 90 plus degrees lately, and so I used a post hole digger and a bucket with a rope and lowered it down, filled it halfway, brought it up, dumped it out. And so all of these beds nearby, so now we've got even more context diversity. We've got a much wetter place, great drainage down into this hole, and really well drained beds. They're very low in organic matter, so these beds have all been seeded out to bush beans to fix nitrogen and deal with the crappiness of that soil. But I digress. So this metal ring was put down in there. All the rocks that I found as I dug, I put along the side. I need to source some more rocks from our garden, but the idea is basically to fill it with coarse rocks all the way up so that water can seep in, and then the little bilge pump that's at the bottom, and I'll link in the description to the gear that I used. It's in a bucket with some holes drilled in the bottom and very simple speaker wire attachment. I'm not going to suggest that this is the best way to do it by any stretch. Attaches to a solar panel charger and a $5 hand-me-down battery. And I'll click that on. You can hear it running. So it draws an incredibly small amount, and every day this space refills with water, even though it's been pretty dry. And it fills along. You can see it shooting out. I need to really refine this whole thing and basically mount the hose in a way where it can spray the water in, aerate the tub. And what's nice now is that we can keep this tub filled up. Every day I can pull about 30 to 40 gallons out of that little simple hand-dug scenario. And I've set it up where now as it fills, it inevitably will overflow. So you can see it cascading down. And I went through with a hoary at first and then a shovel and defined the overflow to back up. And this is where the permaculture stuff comes in, the stacking functions. We've got a little bed of cranberries here, and so every time it overflows, that fresh cold water can wick into the cranberry bed. Then it goes upslope by digging down into an overflow trench that has watercress and rice. So here's the watercress growing, about ready to set some seed. You can see that water flowing in. All those are little rice plugs. And then as those overflow, So all this is pretty compacted, high organic matter, clayey soil. So after a real heavy rain, this trench is used passively by nature to vent water moving through the landscape. But here the solar panel is overflowing our storage and then letting it run through. So it goes through more watercress, more rice, downslope, downslope. I'm going to pause here and let it run for a little bit and show you where it inevitably flows. As it overflows along, comes down underneath the fence here, and then hits a 4-inch diameter drainage pipe, which goes past the softwood propagation I talked about just the other day, past our froggy friends. So this is all buried underground. 2 of them are relaxing in the shade right now. Underneath the ground, and then ultimately, you can see the wet spot here, it drains in and helps recharge this whole pond, which I also talked about recently in a video where I resealed this pond. It's holding water beautifully. So every time I plug that solar charger in, it fills that initial multi-hundred gallon battery of the galvanized tank, so we can water easily from in the garden with all that weight up high in the landscape. But the auto overflow moves through and hydrates a bunch of crops, hydrates and cools off some microclimates, and then ultimately ends up in a pond where we want the water. And then these containers have American water lotus seedling starts. So ultimately this will fill up slowly but surely as we take from that hand-dug spring that costs $0 to develop, with a solar panel and pump system that so far has worked really reliably for less than $100. So there's way more layers to add in. This overflow can be all watercress and rice. We can trench this out wider and keep developing these aquatic systems. But just some ideas of ways to develop a wet spot and have a whole lot of different yield stacks coming out of it. So anyway, thanks for watching.